Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox is one of the most complex and challenging philosophical ideas you're going to find anywhere in Wittgenstein's writing. It concerns his thoughts on meaning and language and how we act as a community, and it seems to set up a really deep philosophical puzzle which says that there can't be any such thing as language having meaning. But it just seems obvious to us that when we talk, when we write, when we use language, we mean something by it. There is something there for us to understand. So what's going on there? Let's jump right into it. Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox crops up in his Philosophical Investigations, his second great work of philosophy, published in 1953, posthumously a few years after his death. Perhaps the main topic of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations is his thoughts on language and meaning, how we use language, how we understand language, how language comes to have a meaning, and how it's possible for language to mean anything at all. And right in the centre of this discussion of language and meaning, between paragraphs 138 and 242, we find Wittgenstein's discussion of rule following and the rule following paradox. So first, let's just say a little bit about why rule following and the paradox is so important to Wittgenstein's understanding of language and meaning. One of the big ideas in the Philosophical Investigations is that language by and large gets its meaning through the way that we use that language. In paragraph 43 he writes, "For a large class of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be defined thus. The meaning of a word is its use in the language." So language is a rule-governed activity. If we want to set up a meaningful language, a meaningful public language within a community, basically what we need to do is give a system of rules for that community to follow in using the words of that language. So we've got this deep connection, according to Wittgenstein, between rules governing how language is used and the meaning of that language. So then the question that arises for Wittgenstein is, what's the connection between the rule itself and its application? That is, the way that we act, the way that we behave according to that rule. Or to put it a slightly different way, what does it mean to act in accordance with a rule? What does it mean to act against a given rule? These are the kind of questions that Wittgenstein is going to focus in on. So having given us this connection between meaning and rules and following a rule, Wittgenstein thinks there is a real deep problem here, or at least some kind of issue that we can get into if we don't think about things the right way. This is often called the rule-following paradox, and he expresses the idea like this. Paragraph 201, "This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule because every course of action can be made out to accord with the rule." What on earth does he mean there? Let me try and illustrate what he means there by giving you an example. One thing I want to point out first, this is going to get pretty weird, and I think it's kind of meant to be a bit weird. Wittgenstein is trying to alert us to stuff that we kind of take for granted in an everyday sense, but when we look at things philosophically, we kind of go, oh yeah, that actually is much more difficult to explain. So there's going to be some weird ideas coming up. You just have to roll with it. Okay, suppose we got these two characters, Anna and Beck, and they're driving along, trying to get to their destination, and they're following various road signs, okay? And the road signs typically say, okay, your destination that way, and there's a big arrow, or, your destination that way, and there's a big arrow. What does it mean for them to follow that rule? Well, that's obvious, right? It just means turn your car in the direction of the arrow. But suppose what actually happens is this. Anna's driving and she turns following the arrow and she turns following the arrow and she turns following the arrow. But on the 10th time, she turns the opposite way to the way the arrow's pointing. And Beck turns to her and says, well, what did you do that for? Why did you do something different? And Anna says, I'm not doing anything different. I'm just doing the same thing I've always done. And Beck says, no, you didn't. You followed the arrow, but this time you went against the arrow, so you did something different. And Anna said, no, that wasn't what I was doing. I was following the following rule. On the first, the second, the third, etc. time, drive the way the arrow's pointing, but on the 10th and the 20th and the 30th time, go the opposite way to the way the arrow's pointing. That's the rule that I was following, and that's what I did. Beck feels really perplexed by this, and I guess we do too. To us, Anna's behaviour seems kind of weird. But, if she was following that bizarre rule, on the 10th and the 20th and the 30th time go the opposite way to the way the arrow says, then she did nothing wrong. She was doing the same thing she'd always done. And in fact, if she had turned on the 10th time the way the arrow's pointing, she would have been breaking her rule. So the kind of question that Wittgenstein's thinking about here, this is not his example, I think it's just one that gets the idea across a bit more simply, is, well, we've got this system of having arrows pointing in directions, okay, and we have these rules. Which rule gives the meaning of the arrow? We've got one rule that basically just says each time you see an arrow pointing in the way you want to go, follow that arrow, and we've got another rule that says do that on all the times except for the 10th, the 20th, the 30th, in which case go the opposite way. Which rule gives the meaning of the arrow? Before we go any further, I'd just like to jump in here and say I hope you're enjoying this content. If you'd like to help me out to make more educational academic content like this, go and take a look at my Ko-Fi page and see how you can help me out. Okay, so like I said, there is weird stuff going on here in Wittgenstein's writings because it just seems obvious to us that there's a right thing for Anna to do, the thing that we would all do, follow the arrows, and a wrong thing for her to do. But the question really is, what is it about her or about anyone that shows that we're following a particular rule rather than some other weird rule? Well, you might say to yourself, every time I go out driving and I see an arrow pointing to where I want to go, I follow the arrow, so it's pretty clear that I'm following the usual rule, follow the direction of the arrow, rather than the weird rule that says on the 10th and the 20th time, going the opposite way. But let's just suppose that each time you've been out driving, you've never made more than, let's say, 60 turns or 90 turns or whatever. Okay, so consider the following rule. You're gonna follow the direction of the arrows apart from on arrow 100, an arrow 200, an arrow 300 or whatever. And on those cases, you're gonna go opposite it. Then really no fact about your past experience shows which rule you are following, the kind of common sense one or the weird one, because by hypothesis, you've never got to arrow number 100 before. Now, there's lots of different questions, different philosophical issues about rule following that we could talk about here that Wittgenstein isn't really trying to get at. So we've got rules being vague, okay? Some rules are just vague and it's hard to know what counts as following that rule or not. That's not what Wittgenstein's talking about. We've also got rules that clash with other rules. So maybe we're trying to follow two rules, like moral rules or legal rules, and they seem to clash in certain cases, okay? That can definitely happen, and it's a philosophical issue, but that's not what Wittgenstein's talking about here. So Wittgenstein usually picks mathematical examples when he's talking about rule following, basically because we think of mathematical rules as being unambiguous, they're precise, they're not meant to conflict with one another, and the idea is, if we have these rule-following problems, even in the case of mathematics, they're going to crop up everywhere. So it's not just a problem for following mathematical rules, they're going to be a problem for following any kind of rule. Now, if you read those central bits of the philosophical investigations where Wittgenstein's talking about rule following and the rule following paradox, it's pretty difficult to follow. It's difficult to see what the problem is, what he thinks the solution is, whether he even thinks there's a solution there or not. One of the most influential commentaries on Wittgenstein on meaning and rules and rule following is Sol Kripke's 1982 book, Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language. Kripke's trying to do two main things in this book. The first is to give a clear interpretation of the problem as he sees it in Wittgenstein. And the second thing Kripke's trying to do is give his solution to the problem. Kripke, just like Wittgenstein, sets up a simple mathematical example. So he's thinking about adding numbers together. Okay, simple answer, 125. But Kripke points out there is this other function out there. It's just something that he's made up out of the air. He calls it quaddition, and it's defined like this. If you've got numbers lower than 54, you just do the normal thing and add them together. But if either of the numbers are bigger than 54 or 54, then you just give the answer 5. Okay, that's a daft function. No one really does that. But Kripke's question is, suppose that you just never added together numbers 54 or bigger before. What is it about you and your past actions, your intentions, your education, or any of that stuff that shows that you are adding rather than quadding? In other words, what did you mean by the plus sign. What did you mean by that bit of language? Did you mean the addition function or the quaddition function? Well, obviously we want to say, we meant addition. I'd never heard of this quadding business before. Clearly I meant addition. But what fact about you shows that that's what you meant? As Kripke points out, it can't be your past actions because by hypothesis, all the numbers you've added together before, they're smaller than 54, so adding and quadding would have given the same answers, so it can't be your past actions that shows which one you meant. And you might say, well, I'm just going on as I did before, right? I've always added numbers together, fine, and I'm just doing the same thing here. But it's fairly easy to see that that answer won't do, because if you were always adding in the past, then you should go on and give the answer 125, and if you were always quadding in the past, then you should give the answer 5 now. Okay, so you say, look, let's just try and break this down and understand what adding means. Adding two numbers together basically just means I add 1 to this number number of times, okay? So if I'm adding 3 and 3, then I add 1, I add 1, I add 1, I do it 3 times and I get the answer. So really, adding is just about repeating add 1, and add 1 is really simple, so problem solved, right? Well, not really, because we've got add 1, but we've also got this other thing, quad 1. So we add 1, we add 1, we add 1, apart from in certain cases where we just forget all that stuff and give the answer 5. So we can underpin addition with the add 1 function, but we can also underpin quaddition with the quad 1 function. So we're just back to the original problem now, basically. What fact about us, our past action, shows us that we were basically adding 1 as opposed to quadding 1 in the past? Nothing can, because by hypothesis, those functions agree on all the numbers we've ever encountered in the past. It's only when we get to the bigger numbers, the numbers 54 and up, and, by hypothesis, we haven't encountered those numbers before. And a lot of people have pointed out maybe the interpretation isn't kind of very Wittgensteinian. I don't really want to get into the issue of, is it a really accurate interpretation or not? I just think it's useful to look at Kripke's explanation, because trying to understand exactly what Wittgenstein was talking about by reading the philosophical investigations isn't easy at all. So that, in a nutshell, is basically Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox. So I want to say a little bit now about what Wittgenstein went on to say about it and whether he thought of it as a genuine problem or not. And then I'll also say a little bit about what Kripke thought the solution should be. So on my reading, Wittgenstein doesn't, at the end of the day, think that the rule-following paradox is a genuine problem. He thinks it basically reveals a misunderstanding in our theorizing about how language works. So he says, paragraph 201, it can be seen that there is a misunderstanding here from the mere fact that in the course of our argument, we gave one interpretation after another. That is, we try to work out what I mean, what I intend by this plus symbol, and we think about, okay, is it this rule or that rule? Okay, so we need a rule to interpret a rule and maybe another rule to interpret that rule, and we just get in this kind of big mess and all of a sudden we don't know what we mean. Wittgenstein thinks that this just shows that we've made an error there right at the first step, where we basically try to give a rule to interpret a rule. Instead, Wittgenstein says, when I obey a rule, I do not choose. I obey it blindly. Okay, what does that mean? What does it mean to obey a rule blindly? Well, I don't think it's completely clear what Wittgenstein means, but around this part of the philosophical investigations, he talks a lot about practice, and he kind of links following a rule to the kind of training we have. So we are trained to follow a rule in such a way that when we come to act on that rule, we don't think, okay, what does it mean? We just act. I think that's what he means by following it blindly. So Wittgenstein compares following a rule to following an order. When someone tells you, go and do that thing, and you just do it, okay? You're not really thinking about what they mean or should I do it or whatever. You just do what they tell you to do. And Wittgenstein thinks that following a rule, that is acting in accordance with the meaning of the word, is basically something like that. He says in 198, I have been trained to react to this sign in a particular way, and now I do so react. A person goes by a signpost, only insofar as there exists a regular use of signposts, a custom. Okay, so this is a really interesting point. I think it's maybe one of the central points in all of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language in the philosophical investigations. This idea of there being a custom that underpins meaning. For Wittgenstein, a custom isn't just another rule, but rather it is our being embedded in a social situation, a community. So without that community of language users, there would be no such thing as meaning. So this way of thinking about things ties in quite closely with Kripke's way of trying to solve Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox. So Kripke sets out how he understands the skeptical problem, the rule-following problem, and then he says, well, in a way it's right. What the problem establishes is that there can be no facts about meaning. There can't be any facts about me, my education, my past history, my use, that dictates that I mean this thing rather than this thing, this function rather than that function or whatever, by a mathematical symbol or by any word. So that's the kind of skeptical bit of Kripke's analysis of Wittgenstein. What Kripke then offers is what he calls a skeptical solution. He's not trying to rebuff or reject the skeptical line, but rather he's trying to say, granting that there are no facts about meaning, we can still have meaning, words still have meaning, it's just not how we thought of it before we met the rule-following paradox. So on Kripke's view, a community of speakers, of language users, is essential for any bit of language to have any meaning. It just wouldn't make sense for an individual in isolation to be the only one who ever used that language and for it to be meaningful. It wouldn't even be a language at all, according to Kripke. So on this view, meaning isn't an objective phenomenon. That's basically what he means by saying there are no facts about meaning. But that doesn't mean that meaning is subjective, according to Kripke. It's not like you or I or anyone gets to use language any way we want. So we're not Humpty Dumpty who can just use, a word to mean absolutely anything. There are kind of constraints on what words mean. So meaning isn't objective, it's not subjective, but it's intersubjective. Meaning exists in the interrelation of all of us in this community of language users. Lots of Wittgenstein scholars don't really like Kripke's take on Wittgenstein, and the main source of contention seems to be that Kripke tries to give a solution, albeit a skeptical solution, to the problem, whereas Wittgenstein seems to be saying there's kind of no problem here in the first place. The problem is only there because we have misunderstood how language works. And Wittgenstein is pretty clear in the philosophical investigations when he's talking about the purpose of philosophy and the method of philosophy, that really we're not out there to form grand theories about meaning or about anything else. Rather, we're just trying to uncover mistakes that we as philosophers go in for, in particular about the way that language is used. So the problems aren't there to be solved, it's rather we just uncover the mistakes that we've made. And I think all of that's true in the sense of that is what Wittgenstein genuinely thought about philosophy. So in that sense, Kripke's skeptical solution can't be a genuinely Wittgensteinian one in the sense that, Wittgenstein would have agreed with it. It's still Wittgenstein inspired, and the way I see it is that Kripke read Wittgenstein, he saw a genuine problem there, but also thought it's a problem to be solved, and here's the solution. What Kripke says, he's quite upfront about this. He's not trying to get to grips with exactly what Wittgenstein meant or exactly what Wittgenstein would have said. He's basically said, well, I read Wittgenstein, and here are the ideas as they struck me, Kripke, and here's my solution in a kind of Wittgensteinian spirit. So some people call this Kripkenstein. It's kind of, a mashup of Wittgenstein and Kripke. Kripke calls it Wittgenstein as it struck Kripke. What do I think? Well, I think the rule-following paradox is a really, really deep philosophical issue. And I guess I agree with more on the Kripke side than on the traditional Wittgenstein side, in that if there is a philosophical problem there, then it's kind of your job as a philosopher to try to understand what's going on there and to try to come up with a solution, or at least with some theorizing that helps us think around the problem. For Wittgenstein, that was a mistake. For Wittgenstein, the job of the philosopher is not to theorize, but just to describe, just to look at how things are and how we do things. And Wittgenstein thinks that if we do that with enough attention, if we do it carefully enough, the problems turn out to be non-problems. I think that's a fundamental mistake. Switch the topic. Forget meaning for the time being. Let's think about moral issues, let's say. It seems pretty obvious to me that we could describe the way that people behave, morally, immorally, with all the detail and attention you like, and that wouldn't really help us with moral questions like, how should I act in this case? If you want to know what's morally right and wrong, you need to do some philosophical moral theorizing. You have to understand what it means, what it is to act in a morally right or a morally wrong way, and then think about how to apply that general theory to the specific case to tell you what you should do or shouldn't do or try to do in this particular case. And I think that's a model for philosophy in general. So not all of philosophy is practical philosophy, a lot of it is theoretical philosophy. If we're thinking about meaning, how meaning is possible, then we're in a very theoretical area of philosophy. But I still think it's part of the job of philosophers to identify problems, articulate them clearly, and then to come up with theories or at least ways of thinking about the issue that ideally solve the problem or at least give us some kind of understanding of what's going on there. But with that said, I think that Wittgenstein's discussion of meaning and language and rule following is some of the most challenging and difficult but profound philosophy, definitely in the 20th century and pretty much of all time. So I definitely suggest you go and have a look at that, look at some of the secondary literature, look at Kripke's book. If you want to hear more about Wittgenstein's life and his ideas, go and take a look at this video here. Thank you so much to all my Ko-Fi supporters for making this content possible. Thank you to you for watching this far. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you back here on Attic Philosophy soon.